Wyoming Territory, late October, 1881. The wind came low and biting across the plains as Fletcher Novak reined in his horse near a half-collapsed wagon on the edge of a dry creek. Dusk was slipping fast behind the hills, and the sky had taken on that pale, bruised color that meant snow would not be far behind. He had been heading west out of Rawlins, driving a string of cattle toward the Sweetwater River, when he spotted the wheel tracks veer off the trail and disappear into the brush. He had not expected to find anyone, but there she was. A woman curled beneath the broken frame of the wagon, her skirts wrapped tight around her legs and a baby clutched to her chest. Her face was smudged with dust, lips cracked, and her dark hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. She looked like sleep had taken her out of exhaustion, not peace. The baby was no more than a few months old, swaddled in a thin blanket, its tiny face pale and still. Fletcher climbed down from his horse, boots crunching quietly through the frost-bitten grass. "Madam," he said low. She stirred, eyes fluttering open, wide and brown and wary, her arm tightened around the child. "I do not want trouble," she croaked. "You will not get any," Fletcher said, squatting down beside her. His voice softened. "But you and that baby deserve more than this." She blinked up at him, confused, like she had forgotten what kindness sounded like. "My name is Fletcher Novak," he said. "I am heading west, but I can take you to shelter. There is a station 2 miles back. You both will freeze out here." The woman looked down at her child, then back at him. For a moment, her pride got in the way. He could see it rising in her jaw, in the line of her mouth. She whispered, "We do not have anything to give." Fletcher shook his head. "I did not ask for that." The baby made a soft noise, a whimper more than a cry. That was what finally made the woman nod. He reached out a hand. She hesitated, then placed hers in his. It was cold and small and trembling. He helped her stand, careful not to jostle the baby. "What is your name?" he asked, steadying her. "Odessa Albright," she said, "and this is Daisy." "Odessa," he repeated like it meant something. "Come on, let's get you warm." They reached the station before dark. It was a simple way station, log walls, 1 room, a cookstove, and a cot. Fletcher had used it before when driving stock. He got the fire going, laid out blankets, and warmed milk from a tin for the baby, which Odessa accepted with quiet thanks. She sat close to the fire, legs folded beneath her, Daisy nestled against her chest. Her eyes kept drifting shut, then snapping open again. She was trying to stay alert, even safe. Fletcher poured her a cup of water, handed it to her. "How long have you been out there?" "Since the axle broke," she said. 3 days, maybe 4, alone," she nodded. "My husband died last winter, fever. I was headed to Idaho. My sister lives near Salmon. I thought I could make it before the snow." Fletcher leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You should not have been traveling alone." "I know that now," she said, her voice soft. "But no one else was going to take me." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the baby's breathing and the crackle of the fire. Fletcher watched her for a moment longer, then said, "You can stay here until you are strong enough to ride. There is a town a day out." "I can get you there." She looked at him, searching his face. "You do not have to, I know," he interrupted. "But I will." The next morning, Fletcher found water and boiled coffee. Odessa moved slow but steadier, and Daisy had color back in her cheeks. Fletcher saddled an extra horse, tied Odessa's few belongings in a bundle, and helped her mount. The trail was quiet, snow threatening in the sky. They rode near each other, not speaking much. Odessa kept her hands wrapped around the baby, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was half afraid something might come out of it. "Did you grow up out this way?" she asked once, glancing over at him. "I was born near Fort Laramie," he said. "My folks died when I was 16. "Been riding alone since," she nodded. "That is a long time to be alone," he looked at her. "You too," she did not answer right away. "Since Daisy came, I have not had a choice." They reached Larkspur by dusk. Fletcher paid for 2 rooms above the livery, one for her and Daisy, one for himself. Odessa bathed, ate, and fell asleep before the lamp burned low. Fletcher sat outside their door for a while, arms resting on his knees, listening to the quiet. The next morning, Odessa met him in the small kitchen downstairs. "I do not think I can go to Idaho," she said. "I have not heard from my sister in over a year. I do not even know if she is still there." Fletcher looked at her. Her hair was combed now, pulled back in a simple braid. She looked tired but strong. He saw something in her eyes that had not been there before: resolve. "There is work here," he said. "A boarding house down the street and a seamstress who always needs help." Odessa nodded slowly. "I could try that. And I can help you get started," he added. She looked at him, really looked. "Why?" "Because you and that baby deserve more than what you had under that wagon." Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. She only stepped closer and said, "I do not know what to say." He smiled just a little. "Then do not say anything yet. Just stay." She reached out then, her fingers finding his sleeve. It was a small touch, but it sent something sharp and warm through his chest. Fletcher laid his hand over hers, holding it gently. Neither of them said anything else. But that was the first time they both believed the worst might be over. The wind came down from the north 2 days later, slinging grit through the empty streets before the snow followed. Fletcher stood on the wooden stoop of the livery, collar turned up, watching Odessa cross from the dry goods store with a paper parcel pressed to her chest and Daisy bundled close in a shawl. Her gait had changed, firmer, more certain. She kept her chin high even as the cold cut across her path. He stepped down to meet her, taking the parcel without asking. "I paid for that," she said, but her voice held no real protest. "I know," he said, tucking the bundle under his coat. "But your hands are full." They walked together without hurry, boots scuffing the frost-laced planks of the boardwalk. Fletcher glanced sidelong as Odessa adjusted the shawl around Daisy's sleeping face. "She keeping well?" he asked. "She started teething," Odessa said, her expression tightening. "Won't sleep unless I hold her upright. Last night she cried until my ears rang." Fletcher opened the door to the boarding house for her. "You try rubbing a little whiskey on her gums," Odessa's brows lifted. "And where would I get whiskey?" he shrugged. "I got some, for trade or teeth." She looked up at him then, her mouth softening almost into amusement. "I'll take you up on that." Inside, warmth rose from the pot-bellied stove near the center of the parlor. Odessa unwrapped Daisy and pressed a kiss to her fine hairline before retreating upstairs. Fletcher waited, feeling the quiet settle over the room, the clink of dishes from the kitchen, the low murmur of women sewing near the back wall. Odessa came down again after a spell without the child, sleeves rolled and her hair pinned up tight. He handed her the folded cloth bundle she'd dropped when Daisy stirred. "You forgot this." "Thank you," she said, tucking it beneath her arm. "I got a position, Mrs. Kelly needs help mending uniforms for the stage company. I start tomorrow." Fletcher nodded. "That'll keep you indoors while the snow comes." She hesitated, then leaned a little closer. "Will you still be in town?" "I'm not in a rush," he said. "Winter's got its own way of making men stay put." "Good," she said, and then, more quietly, "I'm glad." They didn't speak again until the sun dipped low. Fletcher was lighting the lamp in his room when he heard her knock. She didn't wait for him to ask, just stepped inside, eyes steady, hands folded. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she said simply. Fletcher didn't move. "You and Daisy are safe here. I know that." She paused. "That's not what I meant." He crossed the space between them and touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers. Her skin was warm from the firelight, and she leaned into the touch like someone who'd gone too long without one. "I won't take what you're not ready to give," he said. "I've given everything I had already," she answered. "What's left I choose." He kissed her then, slow and quiet, like he was listening to her breathe through the silence. She didn't flinch and didn't rush. Her hand found his shirt front and held there steady. Later, when she lay beside him in the narrow bed, her head tucked beneath his chin, she asked, "Do you think people like us can have something lasting?" "Depends what you mean by lasting," he murmured. She was silent for a long time. "Not forever," she said at last. "Just long enough to feel like we belong somewhere again." He pressed his lips to her temple. Then yes, I think we can. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, tapping against the window pane. Inside, the lamp burned low and neither of them moved. By mid-November, the snow had finished settling over Larkspur like a slow, deliberate hand. Wagons moved slower. Horses steamed at their flanks. The sun, when it showed at all, gave more light than heat. Fletcher took to helping around the livery while Odessa stitched through the daylight hours in the back room of Mrs. Kelly's shop, Daisy asleep in a basket behind her or fussing softly in her lap. Evenings, Odessa would sometimes meet Fletcher by the stove in the boarding house kitchen, her fingers red from thread and lye soap, her shoulders drawn but not bent. They didn't speak much those nights, just passed a mug back and forth, Fletcher watching her eyes as she watched the fire. One morning, Odessa knocked on the livery door, Daisy bundled tight against her chest, her wool cloak dusted with flurries. Fletcher had just finished oiling a saddle when he looked up. "I need to get out of town for a few hours," she said, wind tugging at the ends of her braid. "I'd like to show you something." He didn't ask questions. Just saddled 2 horses and secured a place for Daisy across his saddle horn, cushioned with folded blankets from the storeroom. They rode west across the frozen flats, snow crunching beneath the horses' hooves. Odessa led, glancing back only once to be sure Daisy hadn't stirred. After nearly an hour, she slowed near a crooked cottonwood standing alone in the field, its branches bare and rattling. "There," she said, dismounting. The snow had drifted around a low rise of stone, half covered now. Fletcher crouched beside her as she brushed it clear with her gloved hand. Beneath the frost, a name had been carved: Odessa Albright, 1856–1880. She didn't speak for several breaths. Then, he was buried here. We stopped during the storm, and he never stood up again. I tried to get someone to help after, but no one would go out, said I'd best move on, so I did. Fletcher didn't move. "I didn't mean to come back to this spot," she said, "but the wagon broke not far from here. Maybe that wasn't a mistake." He looked out toward the far horizon. "Some places don't let go." Odessa pressed her hand to the stone. "I don't want Daisy to grow up with only ghosts." "She won't," he said quietly. "Not if I can help it." She turned to him then, eyes unreadable. "When I met you, I thought you were just passing kindness. I didn't think it would last." "I didn't think it would either," he said. "But then you stayed." Odessa gave a slow nod. "I'm thinking about taking over the small house behind the millinery. The owner's gone back east and the rent's fair." "Needs a stove, but it's sound," Fletcher said. "I helped roof it last fall. I could make it a home." He didn't answer right away. Then, not alone, she looked up at him, wind catching her cloak. "Are you offering?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it." "Then say it plain." He stepped closer, snow creaking beneath his boots. "I want to be with you. I want to help raise Daisy. I want to build something that doesn't leave you out in the cold." Odessa studied him, then reached out and rested her hand on his chest over the wool of his coat. "Then come see the stove with me." They rode back in silence, but it was the kind that held promise, not distance. When they reached the boarding house, Fletcher carried Daisy upstairs while Odessa spoke to the landlady. That night they sat at the kitchen table again, only this time Odessa reached for his hand first. The stove arrived 2 days later. Fletcher installed it himself. Odessa lit it with one match, and they stood together in that bare, warm room, watching the flame settle steady in the belly of the iron. There was no ceremony. No need for it, they were already home. By early December, light came late and left early, the days short as breath in cold lungs. Odessa's house behind the millinery had taken on a lived-in shape curtains stitched from old muslin, a pine cradle set near the stove, walls faint with the scent of boiled herbs and wood smoke. Fletcher brought in dry kindling and mended the back step when it cracked beneath the weight of ice. He never stayed the night, not yet, but his coat hung on the hook near the door, and Daisy reached for him now without hesitation. That morning, Fletcher knocked with a wrapped bundle under his arm. Odessa answered with the baby slung against her hip, her free hand tucked into the pocket of a thick wool apron. "What's that?" she asked, eyeing the cloth parcel. "Saddle blanket." Daisy's going to outgrow that cradle come spring. Figured I'd get ahead of it. She stepped aside to let him in, glancing at the snow melting along his shoulders. You planning to build her a bed, if you'll let me, he said, brushing off his hat. She closed the door behind him. You already built the shelves and the cupboard. You really think I'm going to stop you now? He set the bundle down on the table. You've got a way of making a man feel welcome. That's because I want you here, she said, not looking away. They stood in that quiet for a moment, the silence not uncomfortable, just full. Then Daisy stirred and let out a soft, breathy sound. Fletcher stepped closer, brushing a thumb gently across her cheek. She's growing fast. She's teething through her sleep again, Odessa said. I can feel another one coming in. Keeps her restless. I could try holding her some nights, he offered. Give you a little peace. Odessa's brow lifted. You offering to sit up with a crying child just to give me rest? I'm offering to be part of this. He looked at her levelly. Not just the good parts. She shifted Daisy against her shoulder and let out a breath. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. Odessa took a step toward him. Then come tomorrow at sundown. If she wakes, she's yours till the fire dies down. He nodded once, slow. I'll be here. Later that week, Odessa walked to the church hall where the town was sorting goods for families north of the ridge, trapped by wind-drifted snow. She bundled Daisy and left her with Mrs. Kelly, who now watched the girl with the same care she gave her own granddaughters. When she came back, cheeks stung red and hands raw from handling crates, Fletcher was already on the stoop, rubbing Daisy's back as she napped against his chest. I didn't think you'd be here this early, Odessa said, setting her gloves on the table inside. She cried through the hour, he said. Mrs. Kelly sent for me, said she was asking for me by name. Odessa leaned her back against the doorframe, watching him rock the baby. She's not the only one who does. Fletcher looked up. You asking for me now? I'm asking if you'd consider staying longer than the evening. He didn't answer right away. Just looked around the room, the cradle, the stove, the bit of mended lace Odessa had draped over the shelf. Then his gaze settled on her. You sure? I'm sure, she said. But I won't ask you twice. He stepped across the room and set Daisy down with practiced care, then turned to Odessa and took her hand. I'll stay. She didn't smile, not fully. Just leaned her forehead against his, her fingers curling around his. That night they moved quiet through the house. Odessa lit the lamp and folded the quilt at the foot of the bed she'd made from the frame he built. Fletcher hung his coat on the hook beside hers, now side by side. When the wind rose outside, they didn't speak of it. They only listened to Daisy sigh in her sleep and the fire settle in the stove. And when Odessa reached for him, it was without hesitation, without question. She didn't ask for promises. She didn't need to. Everything she needed was already there in the way he held her, in the quiet strength of his presence, in the steady breath he gave back to the home she'd built. When morning came, there was no fanfare, no grand shift. Just the sound of the kettle beginning to boil, the feel of warm arms around her waist, and the slow certainty that, after everything, they'd arrived at something whole. The last Saturday before Christmas brought a stillness that settled over Larkspur like breath held tight. Snow clung to the rooftops in thick, undisturbed layers, and the streets, usually marked with wagon ruts and boot tracks, lay clean and white. Inside the house behind the millinery, the air held the scent of cinnamon bark steeped on the stove. Fletcher worked in the lean-to behind the house, sanding down the edges of a small, wide-legged chair he'd been shaping from pine. Odessa had asked nothing of him, but he had watched Daisy wobble beside the hearth in recent days, catching herself on furniture too tall for her reach. He wanted her to have something her size, something she could grow into. When he came in, Odessa was bent over a square of canvas, stitching a border of red along its edge. Her hair was bound with a ribbon the color of dried sage, and her lips moved silently as she counted her thread, her back to the door. I thought I'd find you up to something, he said, setting the chair beside the fire. She looked over her shoulder. You always do. He crouched to press his fingers along the joints of the chair. Reckon this'll hold her through spring. She'll have it longer than that, she said. If you build it, she keeps it. He stood and moved to hang his coat. Odessa set her needle aside and crossed the room to him. Mrs. Kelly's cousin's coming through town from Cheyenne next week, she said. She's looking for someone to help open a shop, dry goods mostly. But they want someone steady. He drew back just enough to see her face. You thinking of taking it? I told her I'd consider it if she'd let me work from here. She agreed. Her eyes lifted to his. I want to be able to keep Daisy close. And I want to keep building a life that's ours, not just borrowed from someone else's. Fletcher's hand found the back of her neck and held there gently. That's the best thing I've heard all week. She rested her forehead against his chest. I used to think surviving was enough. But now I want more. You've had to carry too much alone. You're not alone anymore. The fire crackled low, warm against the floorboards. Daisy stirred in her sleep, curled into the quilt Odessa had sewn from leftover scraps. Fletcher kissed Odessa's temple, then her cheek, then the corner of her mouth. She met him fully then, her hands at his jaw, her breath steady. When they parted, her eyes searched his. I want to be your wife, she said plainly. Not because I have to. Because I choose to. He didn't speak right away. He only looked at her like she'd spoken something he'd been carrying on his tongue for weeks. I've been waiting to ask, he said, but I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. I'm ready, she said. I've been ready. They married the next afternoon in the parlor of the preacher's house, with only Mrs. Kelly and her eldest boy to witness. Odessa wore a high-necked dress she'd hemmed herself and a sprig of dried yarrow pinned to her collar. Fletcher shaved clean and wore the same coat he'd worn the day he found her near the creek. Daisy sat in Odessa's arms, blinking sleepily at the warmth of the fire. Afterward, they walked home by lantern light, snow falling soft as ash all around them. Fletcher carried Daisy close, swaying with her weight, while Odessa held his free hand tight in hers. Inside their home, the cradle had been moved to make room for the bed they now shared. The chair Fletcher built sat beside the hearth, its legs dusted with pine flower. The house was still small, but nothing about it felt temporary. That night, Odessa curled against Fletcher beneath the quilt, her hand resting over his heart. She said nothing, but he knew the rhythm of her breathing now, the way she stilled when she was content. He kissed her knuckles. We made it. Her fingers curled around his. We did. Spring thaw came slow but steady. The roof held, the stove burned true, and Daisy took to walking with a determined wobble that made Fletcher laugh from deep in his chest. Odessa's dry goods arrangements took hold, and the front room was soon lined with bolts of calico, jars of pickled beets and wrapped parcels of flour and tea. Women came from as far as the southern ridge to barter, and Odessa never turned one away without a fair deal. Fletcher took work running fence posts and hauling feed, but he came home each evening with sawdust in his cuffs and a kiss waiting at the door. Daisy squealed each time he lifted her, fingers gripping his shirt like she'd never let go. One evening in late May, Fletcher sat on the porch steps, Daisy on his lap, watching Odessa hang laundry along the line. The wind tugged gently at her skirt and carried the scent of creek grass and lilac. She turned, shading her eyes, and smiled at him. He smiled back, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Behind him, the home they had built together stood quiet and strong. Ahead of them, the hills rolled into green and gold, the sky wide and open and theirs. And for the first time in either of their lives, there was nothing left to run from, only something worth staying for.